My name's Joe Bain. I'm the current chair of the New Zealand Society for Safety Engineering, and I'm here to briefly talk about the society, about who we are and what we do, and then to introduce Brendan and hand over the presentation to him. So, just to give you a brief overview of the session we've got planned for today, I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing the society. Brendan will talk for 35-ish minutes, depending on pace and thoughts that occur to him at the time. And at the end, we will have some time for questions. You'll all be able to see the Q&A tab on your screens. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please just type it into there as it occurs to you. And then at the end, I will come back on and moderate, I guess, select a few to ask Brendan and get him to answer. We'll answer as many as there is time for, but if we are getting a lot of questions, then I'll pick and choose a few based on whim, I guess, based on my expectation of what I think is going to be most useful to everybody. And then if there are a lot unanswered, we'll find some way to resolve that afterwards. So, the New Zealand Society for Safety Engineering is a technical group of Engineering New Zealand. We've got three main objectives, which you can see on the slide that's currently up on screen. The primary one being to help foster health and safety best practice throughout the engineering profession and to help engineers share their expertise. And we also act to represent the profession with regulators like WorkSafe and NZSSE and so forth when they're doing things or taking decisions or developing regulations that will affect our work as engineers. And finally, we serve as a contact point for regulators when they need technical expertise to support their work. So from time to time, for example, we will help WorkSafe find an expert to support them with investigations and so forth. So how do we set about achieving these goals? Well, at the moment, in the last year, mostly in the form of webinars, because we've all been stuck at home for a while. Lots of webinars. We have also a members area on our website where we keep copies of our seminars and webinars, where there are forums for members to ask questions and have discussions and share their knowledge. We engage with regulators. We collaborate with other technical groups to put on joint events. For example, we also work with and try and engage with professional bodies for health and safety people outside of engineering, so the likes of the Health and Safety Association of New Zealand and so forth. And on the subject of webinars, we've got a couple of upcoming things that you might be interested in. We've got a machinery safety session coming up on the 22nd, I believe. We've got a session on Safety 1 and Safety 2, which hasn't been scheduled yet. We haven't picked an exact date for yet, but it's coming up. A session introducing the Health and Safety at Work Act to recent graduates and new migrants that we're looking at doing in conjunction with the Special Interest Group for Migrant Engineers, and many more besides. So, yeah, we get quite a lot done. Keep an eye on us. If you would like more information, our website is linked on the slide you can see right now, nzsse.org.nz. Feel free to take a look. And with that, I will move on to introducing Brendan, who's going to be the actual presenter for today. Brendan is a member of the committee for the Safety Engineering Society, and when we were asked to help put on one of these lessons learned seminars, he stuck his hand up, so here we are. Brendan is a chartered civil engineer, a CPEng, a CMEngNZ and a CEng. His work is predominantly in the design and management of temporary works, particularly for medium to large building projects. And he also facilitates temporary works training courses across Australia and New Zealand. So this particular topic is very much in Brendan's wheelhouse. And without any further ado, Brendan, I'll hand over to you. And I'll come back in at the end when there are questions to moderate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that. Just very briefly, I think I'd like to say that I've been involved with the NZSSE now for well over a year, on the committee for the last kind of 6 months or more, I think. And they're very passionate people, very keen to make a difference in that safety space, particularly the health and safety by design space. So If you are interested in learning more, I'd recommend you to get involved and look up the website and contact us to let us know how we can help you really. So please do that. As I we kind of alluded to earlier, this is a Teamfree Works session, if you like, looking at some of the recent failures of the industry, as well as historical failures, and really how that's trying to drive some of the lessons learned more out to the industry now than maybe what it was capable of or capacity for in the past. Short agenda, try and put a bit of a definition around or what exactly are temporary works, what we mean by them, what they're not, what needs to go through a robust kind of procedural process. Look at a few recent failures across the industry, some case studies there, what were the root causes of those failures, and I'm sure you'll find that in relation to those particular failures and others that you may or may not be aware of, some of those root causes are very much aligned to the same kind of idea of this procedural control element, which we'll refer to quite a bit over the course of the next hour. Unfortunately, Cordell has been unable to join us today. He was going to go through the WorkSafe Enforceable Undertaking assessment process, if you like. I'll cover that in pretty broad terms in a single slide. I hope you get well soon, Cordell. All the best, mate. And in the afternoon session is saying, hey, look, we have these wider responsibility requirements towards safe workplaces. What's the mechanism for doing that? And this is particularly this temporary works risk management and the procedural control function, and that means identification and risk categorisation. So we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as we go through the session. First of all, what are temporary works? Now there's a definition there which is provided by the British standard. That BS 5975 standard's been around since 1982. That standard was developed on the back end of some major and significant failures that occurred in the UK and Europe in the late 60s and early 70s. The result of those investigations into those failures was that there was 27 principal changes that were recommended. The majority of those were picked up by the publication of the standard in 1982. So this standard is at the code of practice for temporary works procedures and the permissible stress design of false work. So that standard is still very much a cornerstone of the industry in the UK. Most recently revised as of 2019, and it's been revised multiple times in between 1982 and 2019. So it's very much over a generation, if you like, of the workforce have gone through knowing that this is a requirement on those projects. The definition found inside that standard is parts of the works that allow or enable construction of, and I've underlined here, protect, support or give access to the permanent works, and which might or might not remain in place at the completion of the works. So if you find that there is a requirement for some kind of structure on your project which protects, supports or gives access, more likely than not that is a temporary works element that needs to go through a level of robust control to ensure that a competent person has adequately reviewed it, assessed it and signed that off. And that's really what we mean by this procedural control element. A big part of that same standard is the permissible stress design of false work. So I'm sure a lot of the terminology that we currently use across the industry, including things such as working load limits, those kinds of terminologies are fed on the back end of that standard. So it's basically talking about factors of safety, it's talking about proprietary equipment, and the use of these working load limits and the like. There is no AFNZS equivalent to this standard, so it's important to note that if you were looking for something similar to this in New Zealand, you're not going to find it, at least in terms of the permissible stress design requirements. Although of late we have recently developed a procedural control guidance document, and I'll talk through the back end of how that's actually been developed and why very shortly. Photograph here of a major project in Auckland City. I can tell you that that was quite a significant project in the sense of the amount of temporary works requirements required to actually enable that project to happen. Obviously, it's important to note that the complexity of the projects actually varies quite significantly throughout. Excuse me, let's go back a slide. And the requirement in terms of the process is very much the same. So whether or not that temporary works element was significantly complex or not will define how it goes through the procedure by way of a standard solution or by way of a design solution. So if we look at some of the temporary works, particularly on this project, for example, some of it's cut off from the photograph, but I can tell you that there's a site cabin gantry which has been installed, sits over top of the footpath, clearly provides some supports to the site cabins and gives access to those site cabins. So clearly that is a temporary works element. Hoardings, gates, demolition methodology for the existing buildings that were in place there so they don't fall over during demolition. Big facade retention scheme there, and the list kind of goes on. So when we're talking about defining the what temporary works are and what they're not, quite common temporary works such as handrails, scaffolds, excavations are usually required on the most smallest project as well as the most larger and complex projects as well. Not every assessment needs to be carried out by a CPEng. There's only a few particular types of temporary works that necessitate or it's required by WorkSafe Good Practice Guidelines and the like that you need to use a CPEng. Otherwise, local councils or local authorities will ask you for producer statements signed by a suitably competent person. So there are a few CPEngs out there who are able to sign off those types of assessments. How are they different to permanent works? So this is quite an important slide I saw from a presentation by my old director in the UK, Stuart Marchand, on him winning a major UK award back last year. So some of the main kind of points of difference is that the stress level that we see in our temporary works is usually very high, or at least it's designed to be high, in a sense that a lot of the times the temporary work structure is designed for a specific loading, is designed for a purpose, that being a 5-ton machine sitting on top of a existing slab. We know that slab is going to see that weight because we are going to put that 5-ton machine on there. So the utilization is usually pretty high with your temporary work structures. Sometimes, and more often than not, the permanent works will never actually see its design case, just by way of the fact you've got so much risk control in place and determining return periods and the like. Robustness also with temporary works is often quite low, so you need to have a look at how your structure will perform if you were to lose a prop or if you were to lose a head tree or one of the feet to a scaffold. Will it result in disproportionate collapse? And often you'll find that by way of understanding the different types of responsibilities there to the various risk profiles posed by that temporary works, the decisions are often made quite clearly that we will accept a degree of risk. We don't expect that scaffold leg will get hit by a car, and that determines that obviously the robustness profile of it. For permanent works, often quite high. Same with design life. You might find a lot of temporary works are only in place for days or weeks, sometimes for months, whereas the design life obviously for permanent works is much longer. That's usually the main kind of way that we understand whether it's temporary or not. Components for permanent works, again, new elements, bespoke elements designed to fulfill a purpose. For temporary works, we're often using proprietary equipment and using that proprietary equipment within its capacities, but that means obviously reuse of that equipment as well. So it's not purposely designed for that particular function, but we're reusing it multiple times to provide multiple uses and reduce the cost of that structure over its lifetime. Design and planning, again, permanent works can be years. Temporary works is often over days, weeks or months. You often get involved in projects which are looking for immediate turnaround. This is often on the back end of planning requirements or not having enough planning up front. So that involvement is obviously quite high as well. And with discipline, permanent works are quite often, you as a designer are resolved around determining the strength of a structure in different disciplines. So you could be a geotechnical engineer or a structural engineer with a timber specialism, or a piling engineer with a piling specialism. But often with temporary works it's multidiscipline. So again, the determination of who is the best person to carry out a design for a formwork and false work might require someone who has a bit of background in scaffolding and false work, as well as timber for the formwork, for the form, if you like, as well as assessments of existing structure to accept some of those loads that come from ties or from the foundations of that structure. And again, with cost pressures, I think temporary works obviously are quite high in terms of the pressures on the project to perform. There's a lot of money involved, if you like, in getting things wrong, and also if you don't allow for that money up front during the bid, or you allow for too much, you might actually lose the project depending on the temporary works requirements. So there's a bit of pressure, if you like, on the projects to manage that risk adequately. What leads to a failure? So I think for this slide in particular looking at the time as well, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and just say, have a look at the video that Glenn Corey and Gordon Hughes put together previously in this session, in the series. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you after this, or at least very soon, shortly after, click on it, have a listen to it. They talk about the various reasons for engineering failures, and a lot of them are very, very similar to what you'll find in relation to the root causes for temporary works failures. A couple of the points I'm just pulling out of that particular session, not learning from mistakes. So we'll talk shortly about a major temporary works failure that occurred back in the mid-70s, around the same time as what the UK failures occurred, which led to changes in the industry, and how we're not picking up some of those failures and some of those recommendations out of those failures and changing the industry as a result. Gap in institutional memory is obviously part of that as well. And I think we'll talk about some of the rule-based human errors as well later on in the session, but I'd recommend you appreciate some of the work that went into putting that session together and going and have a listen. The main kind of thing which I pick up out of that particular engineering failure session to directly relation to things that I still see occurring in the industry today, both in the UK and in New Zealand, is ultimately this problem of complexity of diagnosis, or diagnosis of the complexity, if you like. So if we aren't able to actually understand how complex the issue is, then it's very difficult for us to lead that down a path of finding the right competency of person to perform that assessment. A common root cause for temporary works, I think there usually is. Absolutely there usually is. So I've said here, a lack of understanding of the risk. So if you're not identifying the need for that temporary works early enough, then you're not putting it into a process where you can record it and understand who's taking responsibility for it. I think the actual risk itself can often be quite diverse and complex. So maybe you're not the right person to understand the level of risk posed by that temporary works. So you need to find somebody either on your project or somebody in your team, or bring somebody in external to help you to understand how much of an issue is this going to be. Do I need to get this design put in place now, or do I need to be going back to my permanent works engineer for more information? Is it worth actually taking a step back and saying, can we change the permanent works detail to make it easier or safer or quicker for us to turn this risk or issue around into something which can be resolved easier? But site management of the risk is really sufficient on its own. So unless we have an experienced team and a large project team, you usually don't have that diversity of people and personnel and experience to actually manage all of the temporary risks posed by that project just on site. So you need to give them access to people who are able to inform the decisions that get made towards managing that risk adequately. No one person is responsible, so you hear this time and time again with temporary works failures. I thought somebody else was looking after it, it's not my expertise. If we don't have one person who's responsible for recording it, putting in the register, finding somebody who's competent to perform that assessment, then it can be quite difficult to capture all of your temporary works risks. And again, poor planning. So if I think about some of these things, these are compounding issues, aren't they? So if you don't identify it early enough, it's hard for you to plan around it. It leads to these time and cost resource pressures, and effectively you end up looking for some immediate solutions which are sometimes conservative. And if the design is conservative, that often means it's a higher cost than what it needs to be, or that it's usually acceptable to the project. So sometimes temporary works can be a bit of a dirty word on a project because of the lack of planning or poor planning, leading to emergency works or immediate solutions, which comes at a high cost. So that can obviously help to, or drive, if you like, this poor understanding towards what the temporary works is actually something which is a fundamental requirement for most of our projects, and can be managed safely and within cost and budget if adequately allowed for at that early stage. So I've got a short video here to play. I think it's important to note that when you've identified the temporary works, that's not usually the end of the matter either. So if you don't plan and manage the temporary works adequately, if you don't put it through those robust procedural controls that's required of the temporary works, and actually poorly controlled temporary works can be a larger risk than having no temporary works at all. So obviously here's a video of someone who's obviously seen the fact that there's a free edge on a project. They've taken it upon themselves to actually have a look at that handrail and say, I can put a handrail together, I'm reducing the risk on this project by stopping somebody from falling over there. And now if that person's not capable or competent in designing a handrail and putting it through the controls such that someone's checked the design of that handrail, then that's a larger risk than having nothing there at all. I think I probably know better than to walk up to a handrail and to lean on it. I might walk up to a handrail thinking it's safe and put my hand on it. I might look over the edge, but I certainly wouldn't be putting my weight onto it. If that handrail was not there at all, I wouldn't be going anywhere near that edge. So again, you've got this issue where you're now in a position where you're putting people up against that edge, might be leaning on it and actually putting themselves in a greater risk when there's nothing there at all. So this is a recent failure that occurred back end of the beginning of 2017. This is in Panmure in Auckland. It's quite a major scaffolding collapse, a significant scaffolding, and it was clearly a scaffold that required a significant amount of design. There's various causes, if you like, in behind the failure of this incident. If you look at the WorkSafe EU, it does tell us that the scaffold was overloaded. I'd argue that wherever you see temporary works have been overloaded, that means that they haven't been considered adequately for their full life cycle and have actually been under-designed. So in this case, the scaffold was provided there to sandblast the steel girders to enable the contractor to then repaint them as part of a maintenance requirement. The outcome of the investigations into this one led to, I believe, 2 prosecutions to the main contractor and to the scaffolder, as well as an enforceable undertaking which was accepted by WSP Opus, which is very, very interesting result, if you like, for them, considering that they were actually the engineer to the contract. Now I will just reference you to this document which was put together by WSP Opus in response to that EU. If you are an engineering consultant or you are an engineer to the contract, I think it's important that you have had a good look over it, and had read it and understand it. It came out in July last year. The purpose of the guide is to clarify the obligations of the engineer and under HASWA. So I think there was a bit of a gap analysis that was required as a result of the failure to understand what is our responsibility as the engineer to the contract, providing and managing a safe workplace on a project. And that really is a good guide, I think, for feeding into that understanding at the early stage. Similar to the WorkSafe Health and Safety by Design Good Practice Guideline, helping the consultants during that early identification of risk to manage that risk adequately during the concept and preliminary development stages. Again, just a short extract here from the WorkSafe GPG. I'm sure it's probably familiar with a lot of you. But their ability to influence the safety of the design at that early stage is very high, and that's really why we drive the health and safety by design concept, if you like, during that concept and preliminary design stage of the project. It becomes more difficult to manage that as time goes on. The interesting thing with this, obviously, is that for temporary works, that's usually not considered in any earnest until during the construction stage. If you're lucky, it might be considered a little bit during the bid stage, which is maybe back end of the detailed design stage. But the actual ability to change the permanent works is usually lost at that time. And this is the retaining wall failure that occurred in 2016 on a Fletcher site. This was in Kirkbride. This was a significant collapse in the sense of it was a double-stacked 1-ton block retaining wall We had controls on our project at the time with Teamfree Works procedures. Those Teamfree Works procedures were administered by site engineers, project engineers, supervisors, multiple people with multiple responsibilities towards managing the risk. I can show you the cause of that failure was effectively this, where we had a what was considered at the time to be a standard solution being used by the project, a double-stacked concrete block retaining wall. The same detail had been used previously on the project, and they wanted to use the same detail in a different part of the project. So we'll cover this a bit more detail later, but a standard solution is one that has been previously designed, and you can reuse that same standard design. That becomes a standard solution. So in this case, the pumping of the water out from inside that excavation pumped a lot of the fines out that were sitting underneath the retaining wall. I'll go back a slide here. You can see a lot of the gravels actually have been allowed to run and to fall away from underneath the concrete. The same thing happening here. And it was these two blocks here that actually collapsed when a labour hire employee saw that there was gravel running from underneath the blocks. The gravels were effectively free to run, but they tried to put a piece of plywood in front of the wall, and unfortunately at the time that they were in there, the bottom block rotated and the top block fell on top of them. They broke their leg in two places, and the results of an investigation led to an EU with Fletcher from WorkSafe. It's worth pointing out that the majority of Teamfree Works failures that do occur are potentially fatal events. They are high risk and high consequences of failure. They are usually, as we said before, protecting, supporting, and giving access to structures. This was supposed to be presented by Cordell. I'll very briefly run you through what an EU actually is. Effectively what happens is the regulator WorkSafe will inform you that they're going to put you towards prosecution. You can then signify to them that you intend to put forward an EU, so you're registering your interest in putting in an EU. The EU is effectively saying you are acknowledging that you failed in your responsibility to provide a safe workplace, but you're not admitting to any guilt. The EU process will then begin, which results in the PCBU under investigation applying to say that, instead of going through the courts and the expensive and costly process there, we'll put that same money towards benefits to the workers, industry and community. So the WorkSafe EU, which was accepted for Kirkbride, led to the money being put into industry through the New Zealand Institute of Safety Management, as well as local community through local schools and schools working nearby some of our projects. The panel would then look at that, whether that actually does make a significant change to the industry, and either recommend it for acceptance, which results in a compliance monitoring schedule being put together, or dismissing it, maybe going back and asking for more changes, at which point the EU would be accepted. So unfortunately, of that failure that occurred in 2016 and 2017, those are just two examples of significant Teamfree Works failures that have occurred across the industry in the last hundreds of years in New Zealand, if you like. This was one that occurred in 1975, quite a significant failure again in Spaghetti Junction, Auckland. And this failure was multifaceted again, using proprietary systems, overstressed systems. But what was really interesting out of this failure is that the code of practice is that the recommendation that came out of the investigation was that a code of practice is required to define technical and procedural requirements for the design, checking, erection, inspection that would form the basis of contract documents. So remember, this is the same time as what the major failures were occurring in Europe and the UK at the same time. That led to the British Standard being published in 1982. New Zealand Good Practice has only recently been established, and that being the CSOC Teamfree Works Forum and the Good Practice Guideline in 2019. So how do we ensure these and other Teamfree Works lessons are learnt? And this is probably the main driver for the session today, is that we now have a forum for the industry which is there to try to assist the industry in developing guidance notes or sharing lessons learned and the like, to close those gaps that currently exist. As I said before, there is a series of seminars that get produced by the Teamfree Works Forum. They've very close ties really to the nature of the New Zealand Society of Safety Engineering as well, with the Teamfree Works focus in particular. And this forum is set up so that their meetings are every 3 months or so across the country, in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch in particular. And it gives it authoritative guidance and when required professional leadership to the industry. So the whole purpose is there to understand the causes of Teamfree Works failures and to try to put in practice procedures or changes to help people with tools to enable them to understand their responsibilities and where they can find good practice to manage that risk adequately. The first thing that was published out of that forum was this GPG. You can see that the terminology here is procedural control. So this is really looking at that section 2 of the British Standard and putting a New Zealand based spin on it, if you like. So that's written by New Zealand contractors and New Zealand engineering consultants. The New Zealand contractors and consultants, particularly on the committee at the time of developing that standard, or that good practice guideline, included Fletcher Construction and Brian Perry Civil, as well as Downer and McConnell Dow, Hawkins, Fulton Hogan, as well as Robert Bird Group, Golder, Miyamoto Consultancies, and Starnes as well. So a good cross-section of the industry helping to drive these kinds of changes. That GPG was endorsed by Chassons at the time, Construction Health and Safety New Zealand, so it should be recognised as an industry good practice document. What do you need to know about that document? Well, depending on what your responsibility is to Teamfree Works and whereabouts you sit on the contractor consultant side, the document itself, the Good Practice Guideline, actually defines the roles and responsibilities of people towards managing the risk. The most important person is the Teamfree Works coordinator, who should be appointed to every project, so they have responsibility to the entire project. There are Teamfree Works supervisors or assistants, if you like, that sit underneath them. And their purpose really is to allow the TWC to have that overarching understanding of all the requirements on the project and ensure that the TWS or others are actually managing it by the robust controls inside that GPG. Designated individual is the person responsible to the business, and as I said there, the TWS is responsible to either a package of works or a subcontract, but there's only ever one TWC on the project and they're responsible to that entire project. So if we think about the failure that occurred that led to the Fletcher EU, that was really where we had multiple people with responsibilities, but no one person responsible. And again, that leads back to some of the causes, or the root causes from the engineering failures seminar that was put together earlier in the series. It also defines a framework for managing the risk. So that framework is effectively a series of procedural flowcharts. It shows you from the understanding of the identification of the need right the way through to IFC and construction on site, further through to inspection, maintenance and decommissioning, if you like. As well as risk categorisation, which we'll cover shortly, a Teamfree Works register and a design check certificate. So all of those documents, that framework, the paper, if you like, that sits inside that GPG is what you use to evidence that you have actually put it through the right processes. So that GPG actually is written particularly such that people can take that document and go and use it tomorrow. The TWC, as I said before, is responsible to the entire project. They have this authority to stop works on the project. I guess anybody has a responsibility or authority to stop works if they think it's unsafe. But the TWC is particularly focused on the temporary works that are required on the project. They have an appointment letter that they must sign, and that appointment letter must be countersigned by the designated individual who has approved that they do have the competency to fulfill that role. That competency is assessed based on their requirement to have been trained in the GPG, as well as have the background or experience to the complexity of the project and the temporary works tasks that have been carried out. They will obviously have to identify all the temporary works and categorise the risk. We'll talk about that further later. Must maintain the temporary works register, so it's a register of all the temporary works, and administer the design check certificate requirement. Risk categorisation. In the back of the Good Practice Guideline there is a table there, Appendix E, which tells you what types of temporary works sit underneath each kind of category. These categories 0, 1, 2 and 3. 0 being a standard solution, so an existing detail. If you can build it in accordance with an existing design that doesn't require any further design, so standard solutions. Then there's no need to engage a designer and checker through the design brief procedure and design check certificate procedure. If it's warranted that actually there is no suitable standard solution, you need to engage a designer, and then you engage the temporary works design check certificate process. Categories 1, 2 and 3 basically change the independence of the checker. If you want more information, I recommend you to have a look at the GPG. The main kind of purpose, or main fundamental if you like, is to accept or acknowledge that usually the consequence of failure for temporary works is usually very high. So we actually use the design complexity to inform whether it's a category 0, 1, 2 or 3. As I said before, not every assessment needs to be carried out by a CPEng, depending on the complexity of the design and the risk profile of that particular choice. So if you're looking at the execution criticality for argument's sake, the execution criticality of using, say, a trench shield versus using a shoring method of multiple different types of whalers and props and polling boards and the like, then effectively you're changing the risk profile by the choice of temporary works. So the design check certificate is broken up into these 5 different parts. Part 1 is the design brief, so that's obviously all the information that the TWC is providing to the designer to inform them of what they need to be designing for. So that'll include obviously the project drawings, the requirements for different loading conditions that you're going to be putting into that particular structure, as well as the duration of works and who is taking the responsibility towards inspections and that kind of thing. Once they've received that design brief, they can then crack on with the design. The design certificate's clearly signed by the designer, saying that this IFC design package is suitable to the information that's been provided. The check certificate signed by the checker, and then the TWC signs both the permit to load and permit to unload. Again, if you want more information about that particular certificate and how that works, I encourage you to pick up the GPG and have a read. Very quickly, how to use the GPG. There's 2 options really. One is to use it, use the standard documents included inside it, so anybody can pick up that GPG and use it tomorrow. That's the idea, the way we've written that document. Or it can be used as the framework can be used into the bespoke procedure for the organisation. So I can tell you that inside of Fletcher Construction, our temporary works management plan is almost a copy of the GPG. And the reason for that is that we want to ensure that any subcontractors that we're engaging, they do have the same kinds of requirements of them across the Fletcher group as well as outside of Fletcher's. I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge Mark Headley for putting together these particular examples of how to use the GPG adequately. So actually resourcing and supporting the use of that Good Practice Guideline. These types of tools are absolutely fundamental to helping TWCs understand what's expected of them going through that procedure. So Mark, thank you very much for that. As well as some other initiatives that are being carried by the Temporary Works Forum at the moment. This document was put together last year. It was published in October 2020 and effectively is a summary of what scaffolds, as determined by the GPG published by WorkSafe, need to be signed off by a CPEng. So there is a lot of words or terms, if you like, used inside the GPG that we have taken some time to analyse and basically structured that into a pretty simple table. So if you're not too sure if a scaffold needs to be signed off by a CPEng, then I'd recommend you to download a copy of that from the Temporary Works Forum website, which is twf.csoc.org.nz. Another initiative that has been running recently has been the development of a working platform guidance note for industry. So that's again looking at international best practice. The Temporary Works Forum in the UK published that particular guidance document in 2019, sorry, and that was looking at different types of assessments to enable working platforms for track plants such as piling rigs and cranes to operate on large projects. I know that was recently delivered in a paper at the NZSSE seminar, and we're looking to have that published by mid-2021. So that's just an example of some of the working groups which are currently established underneath the Temporary Works Forum, driving some of these wider initiatives to develop some guidance for industry where there is currently gaps or a lack of good practice. Some of the conclusions which is worth pointing out are really on the back of the this particular session, is that the main kind of issues that we've kind of seen in terms of temporary works failure is a lack of good procedural control. So if we can manage the procedural control element adequately, then we have a better chance of managing those temporary works risks. And that procedural control good practice guideline is effectively the document which you should be managing the risks in accordance with. We now have an industry body which is actively working to close the gaps to the industry, particularly in relation to temporary works, that being the CSOC Temporary Works Forum. I'd encourage you all, if you have an interest in it, to again go to the Temporary Works Forum website, register your interest and get involved in some of the local workshops and meetings that are going on across the country. And we also have this regulator who have a mechanism by way of the enforceable undertaking process to actually try to drive some changes to the industry as opposed to fines. So I think those three things in their own right are absolutely critical, if you like, to seeing change in the industry, particularly in relation to managing our temporary works risk adequately on site. So that is the end of the presentation. I think I've kind of run roughly to time. I suppose in terms of questions, one of the main questions I do often get asked is, where is the main risk that you see currently in the industry, particularly with the fact that we have a good practice guideline in place. And the main risk I still see is that risk categorisation between 0 and 1. So if we don't resource the projects adequately at the beginning, we don't give them the time and the money to understand the requirements, to plan their temporary works requirements, and it's very difficult for them to actually turn around the designs safely and quickly. And when they go to get a design check certificate carried out, if we don't have people there that are able to give them some guidance there and to drive a solution which is a good design solution, then they'll end up trying to change that category from a 1 to a 0 and making do with what they currently have on site. So again, that comes, I think, down to the competency of the temporary works coordinator and having competent people there. That's the end of it from me. Joe, was there any questions that we've been asked?
There are. One of them I addressed when we were going through because it was just wanting a reference to the WSP guide, but there's one there from Stephen. Do you have a feel for how extensively GPG 0119 is applied in construction projects around New Zealand?
It is still a very new document, so in terms of extensively outside of the Fletcher business, I don't know. I can tell you that Waka Kotahi NZTA, they do have the GPG as a minimum requirement on their projects now, so which is basically, I think, where we want to be as an industry. It's a client requirement to make sure that the contractor and the sub-trades are effectively managing their risks adequately. So on NZTA, I think that's probably also Waka Kotahi NZTA. I think that's the place that we want to be, and particularly with that GPG. So I hope that other clients will see the benefit or the reasons behind it, and the idea is that the GPGs, they're not just there to add more paperwork, it's actually there to manage the risk. And they can see that they want that as a minimum requirement on their projects.
Excellent. Well, if anyone else has any... there we go. There's a couple more that arrived. Is there currently a building code pathway to design temporary works?
No. No, I mean, so sometimes we can use some of the verification methods in the back of the building code to help us to design temporary works, so that being retaining walls or ground bearing pressures, that kind of thing. But not particularly, no. Temporary works is very much it's a very diverse and very broad field, if you like, and it's not quite as simple as having a one or two or more guidance, if you like, but that will cover all types of temporary work. So, no.
Okay, Chris is asking, can you please confirm if lift plans are considered temporary works?
So I'd say that lift plans themselves, no. The lift plan that you just put together by your lifting supervisor and signed off by a certified lifting supervisor, that's a separate kind of process and approach to managing that risk, the lifting risk, if you like. But there will be elements of that lifting plan that would require assessment. So there will be some things such as lifting beams, need to be signed off by a CPEng. They need to have a working load limit stand on the side of it. You need to have a certificate that comes with it, and that is a temporary work structure. Same with the establishment of the mobile crane on site, where you have the mobile crane outriggers. You need to assess the load in those outriggers. You need to assess the ground conditions. You need to determine the size of the pads and the performance of those pads to take those loads. So the lifting plan itself is not, but elements of the plan itself would go through the temporary works process.
Okay, and Stephen's asked, is there guidance for us to put in our specifications to set these temporary works requirements?
If that question, I think, is probably asking particularly in relation to the specification to manage the temporary works, then that would be effectively your procedural control good practice guidelines. So as I mentioned before with Waka Kotahi, they have set the GPG as a minimum requirement on their future projects, and that's probably what you're looking to do. You're looking to set that GPG as a minimum requirement.
Okay, I was just about to say, I think that's it, but then another one arose. As a temporary works designer, is there a construction load that should be used and or safety factor, e.g. a 5 kPa construction live load?
Probably a bit of context probably might help a little bit. I think Angus, feel free to give me a call. We can have that discussion offline. But in terms of safety factors, the best you're going to find on information about safety factors is probably the British standard. That does require things such as 1.5 factor of safety for overturning or 2 for sliding, those kinds of requirements. That's permissible stress design. 5 kPa construction live loading, it's quite a significant loading, I think, depending on what the application is, but we can have that conversation offline. Angus, feel free to give me a call.
Just out of curiosity, Brendan, that British standard, was that ever adopted as a European, an EN standard as well, or is it only a BS?
No, I think it's PAS is the British, the European equivalent, PAS 1182, I think it is. Which sets very much the same kinds of requirements as the British standard. So yeah, that's right. It is currently out there, but it has both the controls on temporary works procedure as well as the use of temporary works equipment, the second one.
If anyone's not aware, and the costs of things like British standards can be a barrier sometimes. If you're ever after a standard that's got a European equivalent, then if you go to the Estonian National Standards Body website, evs.ee, they have this thing where their government heavily subsidises the cost of standards, so you can get all the legit European standards for 25 or less, 25 or fewer euros. Estonian cover page, but otherwise just written in English. So it's a useful little trick. I've saved thousands of dollars over the years. Anyway, are there any guidelines specific to temporary works in rivers? That's an interesting one.
In rivers? Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think, not that I'm aware, there may very well be. If somebody has some interest in that, maybe we could set up a working group if there is any particular concerns that you have. Temporary works in rivers is usually things like a trestle or a temporary access staging platform. And again, you're looking at a piling design there, and yeah, there's no particular major issues there. Maybe you're looking at drag, if you like, on the pile. I don't know anything myself. It's not my particular experience, to be honest with you.
Okay, how do you recommend encouraging uptake of the GPG within our own organisations from somebody who works for a medium-sized contractor?
I think the main kind of purpose for having that good practice and the controls around it, the controls around temporary works, is that it drives safer workplaces. So if you have any issue at all trying to drive safer workplaces, I think you've probably got other concerns there. But I would be leveraging that as being the reason for why you need to find out who your DI is. So ask the question of your general manager. Say, look, this is the good practice guideline. This is what it's basically telling us in terms of managing temporary works. The DI is responsible to the business. That's you. What should we be doing? Ask them the question.
Yep. Can we use the GPG codes for fabrication works like manufacture of storage tanks, pressure vessels, etc.? Else any dedicated code is available for temporary works on those activities?
I would not have a clue, I'm sorry. I think that's a great question for the Temporary Works Forum, so I think you need to get involved with the forum. And what was interesting as well, with the first meeting we had at the forum, we had over 100 tickets sold, and when I say sold, they're all free. We had 85, 90 people turn up for that first session, and I was quite amazed, not myself particularly, but a lot of other people made the comment how amazed they were that they didn't realise there's so many temporary works engineers in the country, and a lot of them are struggling with the same issues is probably what that question's coming from. So connecting with the right people, networking has to be
join the forum. All these seminars are always a plug for joining the forum. While you're about it, join the Safety Engineering Society too. This probably relates back to the rivers question. Are coffer dams regarded as temporary works?
100%. Yep, absolutely. So you'd be engaging a geotechnical engineer to provide you that design. Sheet pole, so.
Is the GPG a requirement of the National Code of Practice for utility operators' access to transport corridors?
Sorry, I can't answer that one for you either. Can't help you there.
Outside my field too, I've never heard of it. Sorry. For design of scaffolding, shrink wrap, counterweights and sign-off, does design engineer also need to verify scaffolding components itself, which is a bit difficult as every scaffolder have their own way of scaffolding erection?
Yeah, sure. So when you obviously shrink wrap or sheet a scaffold, then that immediately means it's going to be a CPEng designed scaffold. Does the designer need to verify scaffolding components? I'd say no. I'd say it's responsibility of probably the main contractor to get the right certificates from the supplier of the scaffold that all the scaffold is in accordance with AF NZS 1576.
Cool. And I'll just read out, Martin Larish has added something that's presumably based on, or following up to what we were just talking about, saying temporary works over water are usually high-risk work and piling is certainly a key activity, and for more details please reach out to the Temporary Works Forum. There's no guidance in place at the moment, so I guess Martin would probably endorse what we've been saying, Brendan, to join up, get involved, sort something out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin, for that. I really appreciate that.
Right, well, if there are no further questions, and I think we've dealt with all of them there, I'll just make an observation, which is the thing that sort of struck me was that there was this bifurcation between New Zealand practice and best practice a number of years ago, where Britain went off and sorted out a standard and we kind of just didn't. And that makes me wonder how many other fields of engineering practice are sort of sitting there with us doing what we've always done, where we probably have bifurcated a wee bit from best practice, and whether there are any other time bombs ticking away out there that will be in 10 years' time sitting here having a presentation after some event that's led to an enforceable undertaking, that's led to some sort of forum that's led to improvement. So if anyone can think of anything like that, you know, areas of practice where somebody or industry might need a bit of work, again, another good reason to join the Safety Engineering Society. We'll start kicking. Be nice to get ahead of some of those things. Right, well, that's basically that. Thank you for that presentation, Brendan. I was amazed how close you kept it to the scheduled time. I don't think I've ever finished a presentation on time in my life, so I admire that. It was a really good attendance. We peaked at about 150 people listening in, so hopefully everyone got some real value out of that. I will look forward to reviewing the recording, and I know there's a couple of my colleagues who didn't have time to watch this today who I'm going to sit down and force to watch through it, because I think there's a lot of good stuff to learn there. So yeah, just finally, thank you, Brendan, for taking that time, and thank you everybody for coming along. And with that, we'll pretty much wrap up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe.